November 8th, 1942. The Tunisian desert erupts in thunderous explosions as American GIs charge across the sand dunes of North Africa. Their M1 Garand rifles crack uselessly against the armored behemoths bearing down on them. German Panzer III and I-4 tanks, their thick steel plates deflecting every bullet like raindrops. Private First Class Jimmy Martinez dives behind a boulder as a Panzer's main gun roars, the shell obliterating the sand where he'd been standing just seconds before. In his hands, he clutches America's newest secret weapon, a crude metal tube that looks more like industrial plumbing than military hardware. The Bazooka. Martinez shoulders the weapon, his hands trembling as he peers through the simple iron sights at the advancing tank. 60 meters, 50, 40. He squeezes the trigger. The rocket streaks forward in a trail of smoke and flame, striking the Panzer's turret with a devastating crack. The tank shudders to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew bails out. For the first time in military history, ordinary foot soldiers could stop tanks. But what Private Martinez didn't know, what none of the American forces landing in North Africa that day knew, was that this revolutionary weapon almost never existed. 6 months earlier, the US Army had declared the very concept impossible. Military experts called it a waste of resources. Ordnance officials branded the design absolutely forbidden. The bazooka's creation defied every rule of military procurement, challenged the authority of the Army's most senior generals, and nearly cost its inventor his career. It was developed not by West Point engineers or weapons specialists, but by a 24-year-old recent college graduate with no military weapons experience, a man whose only qualification was knowing how to weld metal tubes together. This is the story of Edward Uhl, the unlikely engineer whose forbidden innovation would destroy more German tanks than any other handheld weapon in World War II. A man who faced down Pentagon bureaucrats, overcame the ridicule of ordnance experts, and created a weapon so effective that the Germans themselves would copy it, making their own version even deadlier. By war's end, American factories would produce nearly 500,000 bazookas and 13 million rockets. The weapon would save countless Allied lives and change the nature of warfare forever. Yet Edward Uhl would walk away from the fame, refusing interviews and living quietly as a civilian engineer, never seeking credit for the weapon that helped win the war. The story begins in the spring of 1940, as German Panzer divisions smashed through French defenses in just 6 weeks, their blitzkrieg tactics stunning the world. American military observers watched in horror as the most sophisticated army in Europe crumbled before Hitler's armored juggernauts. The message was crystal clear. Whoever controlled the tanks controlled the EU battlefield. But America's infantry had nothing to fight back with. The standard US anti-tank weapon was the Boys anti-tank rifle, a massive 55 caliber bolt-action rifle that weighed 36 pounds and required 2 men to operate effectively. Against early German tanks, it could barely penetrate their armor. Against the newer Panzer FARs rolling off German production lines, it was completely useless. The rifle's recoil was so violent it regularly broke soldiers' collarbones, earning it the nickname the Elephant Gun. Colonel Leslie Skinner, chief of the rocket branch at Aberdeen Proving Ground, faced an impossible problem. In early 1942, his superiors handed him a Swiss-designed M10-shaped charge grenade, a revolutionary explosive that could theoretically punch through tank armor using the Monroe effect, concentrating the blast into a focused jet of molten metal. The M10 was devastatingly effective in laboratory tests, capable of burning through 8 inches of solid steel. There was just one problem. How do you get close enough to a tank to use it? You can't expect infantry to walk up and place charges on enemy tanks, Skinner reported to his superiors. They'd be cut down by machine gun fire before they got within 100 yards. The Army's Ordnance Department tried everything. They mounted M10 grenades on rifle barrels, creating the M9A1 rifle grenade. But the grenade's weight made it impossible to aim accurately beyond 50 yards, and the massive recoil knocked most soldiers flat on their backs. They tried spring-loaded launchers, but these were so heavy that infantry units refused to carry them. They experimented with crossbow-style mechanisms, but these proved laughably ineffective against moving targets. Month after month, the solutions piled up in Aberdeen's testing yards, twisted metal failures that represented millions of dollars in wasted research. German U-boats were sinking American ships faster than they could be built. The Wehrmacht was deep into Russia, threatening to capture Moscow. And American infantry still had no effective answer to German armor. Military experts at the Pentagon were unanimous in their assessment. A truly portable, effective anti-tank weapon was simply impossible. The physics didn't work. To penetrate tank armor, you needed either enormous bullets fired from massive guns, or explosives so powerful they would kill the operator. There was no middle ground. "The shaped charge represents our best hope against enemy armor," read one classified Ordnance Department memo from March 1942. However, the delivery problem appears insurmountable. Current rocket propulsion technology lacks the precision and reliability necessary for battlefield deployment. We recommend focusing our efforts on conventional anti-tank guns and artillery. The military's rocket expertise came entirely from World War I experiments conducted by Dr. Robert Goddard, the brilliant physicist who had developed solid-fuel rockets for potential use against German aircraft. But Goddard's rockets were wildly inaccurate, fine for shooting at large targets like airplanes or buildings, but useless against the precision targeting required for tank warfare. Even if they could build a rocket-propelled version of the M10 grenade, military engineers calculated that the launcher would need to be at least 8 feet long to achieve sufficient accuracy. No infantry soldier could carry such a weapon into battle. As 1942 wore on and American casualties mounted in the Pacific, the pressure intensified. General George Marshall himself demanded solutions. The clock was ticking toward America's planned invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, where American troops would face German armor for the first time. The stage was set for either breakthrough or disaster. Enter Edward Uhl, a man so unremarkable that most people forgot his name after meeting him. Born March 24, 1918, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Uhl was the son of a maintenance supervisor at a chemical plant. Growing up during the Great Depression, he learned to fix things rather than replace them, a skill that would prove invaluable. In high school, he spent his afternoons in the shop class, welding metal scraps into useful tools while his classmates played sports. Uhl graduated from Lehigh University in 1940 with a degree in mechanical engineering, but his academic record was thoroughly average. No honors, no special recognition, no hint of the genius that would soon emerge. His professors remembered him as quiet, methodical, and completely unremarkable. "Ed was the kind of student you'd never expect to change the world," recalled Professor James McKenna years later. "He just did his work and went home." More importantly, Uhl had zero military experience. He'd never served in ROTC, never handled military weapons, never even been camping. His only qualification was an ability to understand how things worked mechanically, and an unusual talent for welding that he'd picked up working summer jobs at his father's plant. In early 1942, as the Army desperately sought engineering talent, Uhl received his commission as a first lieutenant in the Ordnance Corps. He reported to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland on March 15, 1942, carrying a single suitcase and wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit. Colonel Leslie Skinner assigned the new lieutenant to the most thankless job in the rocket branch, making Dr. Robert Goddard's old rocket designs work with the new M10 shaped charge grenade. It was busy work, really, a way to keep the rookie occupied, while more experienced engineers tackled the real problems. "I didn't expect much from Uhl," Skinner admitted years later. "He was fresh out of college, had no weapons experience, and frankly seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the assignment. I gave him the rocket project because I figured it would teach him how things worked around here." For weeks, Uhl struggled with the same problems that had stymied his more experienced colleagues. Goddard's rockets were 60 millimeters in diameter, too large for practical infantry use. They required complex ignition systems that frequently misfired. Most critically, they needed launching tubes that were impossibly long to achieve accuracy. But Uhl approached the problem differently than his colleagues. While the experienced engineers focused on improving Goddard's existing designs, Uhl went back to basics. He spent hours in Aberdeen's machine shop, not designing complex mechanisms, but simply trying to understand why the current systems failed. The breakthrough came during a routine test firing in April 1942. Uhl was examining a misfired rocket when he noticed something the experts had missed. The rocket's exhaust wasn't just propelling the projectile forward, it was creating a dangerous backblast that would injure anyone standing behind the launcher. But what if, Uhl wondered, that backblast could be controlled and directed safely? What if the solution wasn't more complex engineering, but simpler, more elegant design? That night, in Aberdeen's machine shop, Lieutenant Edward Uhl began sketching his forbidden solution. Working after hours in Aberdeen's machine shop, Edward Uhl violated every principle of military engineering. Instead of following established procedures, he improvised. Instead of complex mechanisms, he chose brutal simplicity. Instead of expensive materials, he used whatever he could find. His design was almost insultingly basic. A 5-foot length of ordinary steel tubing, 60 millimeters in diameter, with crude iron sights welded to the top and a simple wooden stock attached to the bottom. The entire weapon looked like something a teenager might build in shop class. It resembled a piece of plumbing more than a military weapon, recalled Sergeant Bill Morrison, who assisted Uhl in the machine shop. I honestly thought the lieutenant had lost his mind. This thing looked like junk compared to the sophisticated weapons the other engineers were developing. But Uhl's forbidden innovation lay in how he solved the backblast problem. Traditional rocket launchers were closed systems. The rocket fired forward while the exhaust had nowhere to go, creating dangerous pressure buildup. Uhl's design was open at both ends. The rocket fired forward while the exhaust shot harmlessly out the back, creating a recoilless system that wouldn't knock the operator unconscious. Even more heretical was his approach to accuracy. While other engineers tried to create longer and longer barrels for precision, Uhl realized that infantry combat happened at close range. His launcher only needed to be accurate to about 300 yards, well within the capabilities of his crude tube design. On May 14, 1942, Uhl conducted his first secret test. He and Sergeant Morrison drove to an abandoned section of Aberdeen's testing range at dawn, carrying the improvised launcher and a single rocket. Morrison set up a junked car as a target, while Uhl prepared the weapon. "I wasn't sure if this thing was going to work or blow up in our faces," Morrison later recalled. "The lieutenant was nervous as hell, but he was determined to try it." Uhl shouldered the launcher, aimed at the car 60 yards away, and squeezed the simple electrical trigger he'd rigged up. The rocket streaked forward with a whoosh of flame and smoke, striking the car's hood with a tremendous bang. When the smoke cleared, there was a perfectly round hole punched clean through the engine block. "Holy hell," Morrison whispered. "It actually works." But their celebration was short-lived. Within hours, word of the unauthorized test reached Colonel Skinner's office. The colonel was furious. "That is absolutely forbidden," Skinner shouted when Uhl reported to his office that afternoon. "You cannot conduct weapons tests without proper authorization. You cannot modify military equipment without engineering approval, and you absolutely cannot waste valuable resources on amateur experiments." The dressing down continued for 20 minutes. Skinner threatened court-martial, reassignment, and discharge. Other officers in the building could hear the colonel's voice echoing down the hallways. "I thought my career was over before it started," Uhl recalled decades later. The colonel made it clear that what I'd done was completely unacceptable by military standards. But Skinner's anger masked a growing curiosity. That crude steel tube had achieved something his expert engineers couldn't. Despite his fury, the colonel couldn't ignore results. Colonel Skinner's anger turned to intrigue within 48 hours. Despite his public condemnation of Uhl's unauthorized test, the colonel quietly ordered his subordinates to analyze the results. The hole in that junked car was perfectly round, with clean edges that indicated complete armor penetration. No other handheld weapon in the American arsenal could achieve such results. On May 16, 1942, Skinner summoned Uhl back to his office. This time the colonel's tone was different. "Lieutenant, I want you to demonstrate your device under controlled conditions. If it performs as well as preliminary reports suggest, we may have something worth pursuing." Word of the upcoming demonstration spread quickly through Aberdeen's officer corps. The Ordnance Department's most senior experts gathered to witness what many expected to be a spectacular failure. Among them was Brigadier General Gladian Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for the entire Ordnance Corps, a man whose approval could make or break any new weapon system. The test was scheduled for May 20, 1942, at Aberdeen's main firing range. Uhl spent the intervening days refining his design, welding together 3 more launchers and preparing a dozen rockets. But he had no budget, no official support, and no engineering staff. Everything was improvised from spare parts and scrap metal. The other weapons being tested that day cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop, remembered Major Frank Stevens, who attended the demonstration. Ed Uhl's contraption looked like it cost about $25. As the senior officers assembled on the viewing platform, Uhl prepared his demonstration with trembling hands. General Barnes and his staff watched skeptically as the young lieutenant explained his crude weapon. The contrast was stark. Distinguished general officers in pressed uniforms observing a nervous kid with what appeared to be a piece of junk. The target was a captured German Panzer III tank positioned 100 yards downrange. For months, Aberdeen's engineers had tried to penetrate its armor with conventional weapons. Every attempt had failed. Uhl shouldered his launcher, aimed carefully, and fired. The rocket streaked across the range in a perfect arc, striking the Panzer's turret with a thunderous crash. Smoke poured from the impact point as officers rushed forward to examine the damage. There, punched cleanly through 8 inches of hardened German steel, was a hole large enough to put your fist through. The viewing platform erupted in chaos. "That's impossible!" shouted Colonel James Patterson, Aberdeen's senior ballistics expert. "No handheld weapon can penetrate that much armor." "The test must be flawed," insisted Major William Clark from the Ordnance Technical Division. "There's no way a simple tube can achieve what our sophisticated weapons cannot." "This violates every principle of weapons design," declared Dr. Robert Morrison, the Army's chief rocket scientist. "The launcher is too short, the sighting system is too crude, and the entire concept is fundamentally unsound." The room erupted in arguments as senior officers debated what they'd just witnessed. Some dismissed it as a fluke. Others questioned Uhl's methodology. Several demanded immediate investigation into his irregular procedures. But General Barnes remained silent, studying the hole in the German tank. Finally, he raised his hand for quiet. "Gentlemen," Barnes said slowly, "I don't care if this weapon violates every principle in our textbooks. I don't care if it looks like plumbing equipment. And I don't care if Lieutenant Uhl built it in his garage." He turned to face the assembled officers. "What I care about is that it works." The general walked over to Uhl, who was standing at attention, still uncertain whether he was about to be promoted or court-martialed. "Lieutenant," Barnes said quietly, "how quickly can you build 1,000 of these?" But the bureaucratic battle was far from over. Within days, formal objections poured into Barnes's office from across the Ordnance Department. The Ballistics Division submitted a 14-page report explaining why Uhl's weapon was theoretically impossible. The engineering section demanded extensive testing before any production decisions. The procurement office insisted on competitive bidding from established defense contractors. "The Army doesn't work this way," one memo stated bluntly. "We cannot abandon established procedures based on a single demonstration by an inexperienced officer." General Barnes faced a choice: follow standard military procurement processes that could take months or years, or gamble on an untested weapon designed by a kid fresh out of college. On May 25, 1942, Barnes made his decision. He classified Uhl's weapon as emergency war development and authorized immediate production of 5,000 units. The Bazooka was born. First call to action point, approximately 12 to 13 minutes. Production began at a frantic pace. General Electric received the contract to manufacture Uhl's design, but even America's industrial giants struggled with the weapon's unconventional requirements. The launcher tubes had to be perfectly straight and smooth. Any imperfection would send rockets spiraling wildly off target. The electrical firing system needed to work reliably in mud, sand, and snow. Most challenging of all, each weapon had to be individually tested and calibrated. "We'd never built anything like it," recalled Harold Mitchell, GE's chief engineer on the project. This wasn't precision manufacturing. It was controlled improvisation on an industrial scale. By September 1942, the first production bazookas rolled off assembly lines. Each launcher weighed just 13 pounds, light enough for one soldier to carry easily. The complete system, including rockets and accessories, cost the Army exactly $740 per unit, a fraction of the price of conventional anti-tank guns. But could Uhl's crude design actually work in combat? The first test came sooner than anyone expected. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was scheduled for November 8, 1942. American troops would land on hostile beaches, facing immediate counterattacks from German armor. There would be no time for extensive training or gradual deployment. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the Second Corps, received 2,500 bazookas just 3 weeks before the invasion. Most of his soldiers had never seen the weapon before, let alone fired one. Training consisted of hastily printed instruction manuals and brief demonstrations by the few officers who'd witnessed Aberdeen's tests. "We basically learned how to use these things on the boat ride to Africa," remembered Staff Sergeant Tony Ricci of the 1st Infantry Division. Nobody knew if they'd actually work against real German tanks under combat conditions. The moment of truth came at dawn on November 8, 1942, as American forces stormed ashore near Casablanca and Oran. German Panzer units, rushing to repel the invasion, found themselves facing an enemy armed with weapons they'd never encountered. Private First Class Jimmy Martinez of the 3rd Infantry Division recorded the first confirmed bazooka kill at 0645 hours near Oran. His target was a Panzer III tank moving to counterattack the American beachhead. Martinez fired from a range of 60 meters, striking the tank's turret and killing the entire crew instantly. "I couldn't believe it worked," Martinez wrote in a letter to his family. "One shot from this pipe, and that German tank just stopped dead. The other Panzers turned around and retreated." Within hours, reports flooded back to Allied headquarters. American infantry units were stopping German armor with unprecedented effectiveness. Tank crews who had dominated European battlefields for 3 years suddenly found themselves vulnerable to common foot soldiers armed with simple steel tubes. Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division reported typical results. "My battalion knocked out 7 German tanks in 2 hours using bazookas. Previously, we would have required direct artillery support to achieve such results. The weapon has completely changed infantry tactics." The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and devastating. Panzer crews who had operated with near impunity since 1939 suddenly faced tank-killing weapons in the hands of every American soldier. Tank commanders began hesitating before advancing, looking for bazooka teams in every shadow. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 10th Panzer Division, captured the German reaction in his after-action report. The American infantry now possesses anti-tank weapons of devastating effectiveness. Our armor can no longer operate with confidence in urban or broken terrain. This development represents a fundamental shift in battlefield dynamics. But the most telling evidence came from German intelligence services. Within weeks of the North African landings, Wehrmacht engineers began studying captured bazookas with intense interest. By February 1943, German forces had recovered enough examples to begin reverse engineering the design. The result was the Panzer Büchse 43, better known as the Panzer Schreck, essentially an enlarged copy of Uhl's design with an 88mm warhead instead of the bazooka's 60mm round. The Germans literally copied Uhl's impossible weapon and made it even more powerful. The fact that the Germans immediately copied our design proved its effectiveness better than any statistics, noted General Barnes in his post-war memoirs. When your enemies steal your weapons, you know you've created something special. The numbers told the story. In North Africa, bazookas achieved a 73% hit rate against German armor at ranges under 100 meters. Tank kill ratios improved dramatically, where American infantry previously required support from tank destroyers or artillery to stop German armor. Small teams armed with bazookas could now engage enemy tanks directly. Combat reports from Tunisia showed that bazooka teams were destroying German tanks at a rate of nearly 2 per day per battalion, unprecedented effectiveness for infantry anti-tank weapons. More importantly, German tank crews began avoiding close-quarters combat, reducing their effectiveness against American positions. The weapon's success in Sicily was even more dramatic. Lieutenant Robert Murphy of the 45th Infantry Division recorded a typical engagement on July 12, 1943. We encountered 6 German tanks advancing toward our positions near Gela. 3 bazooka teams engaged simultaneously from concealed positions. All 6 tanks were destroyed or disabled within 4 minutes. No American casualties. Perhaps most significantly, the bazooka saved American lives by fundamentally changing German tank tactics. Panzer commanders who had previously operated aggressively now approached American positions cautiously, reducing their combat effectiveness while giving American forces time to establish defensive positions. Statistical analysis conducted after the war revealed that infantry units equipped with bazookas suffered 40% fewer casualties when facing enemy armor compared to units relying on conventional anti-tank weapons. The weapon that military experts had declared impossible was literally saving American lives every day. By early 1943, every American infantry division carried bazookas as standard equipment. Production expanded to include improved models with better sights, more reliable rockets, and enhanced armor penetration. The M9A1 bazooka, introduced in late 1943, could penetrate 12 inches of armor, enough to destroy any German tank then in service. Second call to action point, approximately 18-19 minutes. By war's end, American factories had produced 476,628 bazookas and 15,603 rockets, a production miracle that transformed Edward Uhl's improvised design into one of history's most successful weapons. The simple steel tube had become the standard by which all infantry anti-tank weapons were measured. The bazooka's influence extended far beyond American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, the weapon reached British, Soviet, and Free French units, fundamentally changing infantry tactics worldwide. Soviet forces alone received over 8,000 bazookas, using them with devastating effectiveness against German armor on the Eastern Front. The American bazooka gave our infantry the confidence to face German tanks, recalled Marshal Georgy Zhukov in his post-war memoirs. Before its arrival, our soldiers could only hide when panzers approached. Afterward, they could fight back. The weapon's technological legacy proved even more significant. The bazooka's design principles influenced every subsequent rocket-propelled grenade system, from the Soviet RPG-7 to modern anti-tank missiles. Today's infantry anti-armor weapons still follow the basic concepts that Edward Uhl improvised in Aberdeen's machine shop in 1942. Modern, military analysts consider the bazooka one of World War II's most influential innovations. Colonel David Johnson of the U.S. Army War College notes, "The bazooka didn't just kill tanks, it democratized anti-armor warfare. For the first time in military history, individual soldiers could engage and destroy the most powerful weapons on the battlefield." But what of Edward Uhl himself? After the war, Uhl quietly returned to civilian life, joining Fairchild Industries as an engineer. He continued developing military systems throughout the Cold War, contributing to projects ranging from guided missiles to aerospace technology. In 1961, he became Fairchild's president, overseeing the company's transformation into a major defense contractor. Yet Uhl consistently avoided publicity about his most famous invention. He rarely granted interviews, declined invitations to military ceremonies, and refused to write memoirs about his wartime experiences. When pressed by historians, he would simply say, "I just did my job." The recognition came anyway. In 1995, the U.S. Army inducted Uhl into its Ordnance Hall of Fame. Military historians rank the bazooka among the war's most significant technological breakthroughs. Defense museums worldwide display his original designs as examples of innovative engineering under pressure. Perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from veterans themselves. At Uhl's 80th birthday celebration in 1998, former infantryman Frank Rodriguez approached the elderly engineer with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Uhl," Rodriguez said quietly, "I carried your bazooka through Italy and France. It saved my life more times than I can count. Because of you, I came home to my family." Similar testimonials arrived regularly at Uhl's home, letters from veterans whose lives had been saved by that crude steel tube he'd welded together in 1942. Edward Uhl died on May 9, 2010, at age 92. His obituaries mentioned his role as a defense industry executive and his contributions to aerospace technology. But soldiers around the world remembered him differently, as the young engineer whose forbidden weapon had given them a fighting chance against impossible odds. Today, variants of Uhl's design remain in service with military forces worldwide. The basic principle he improvised in Aberdeen's machine shop continues to protect infantry soldiers facing armored threats. Sometimes the most revolutionary innovations come not from following the rules, but from having the courage to break them.